Well, tēnā koutou katoa. Good morning, everyone. My name is Justine Dorr, and I'm the Tuma Whakarai Chief Executive of the Royal Society Te Apārangi. First, a karakia to bless our dialogue today. Whakatakata hau ki te uru, whakatakata hau ki te tonga, kia mā kinakina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai. He hi a kia nā te atākura, he tio, he hoka, he hauhu, ti he maureora. I'd like to start by acknowledging our co-hosts at the Policy Hub, Victoria University of Wellington. They and my team have worked together to lift the voices of experts into our communities. The Royal Society has a statutory role in providing expert advice to decision makers and communities alike. Today is one example of us using the Society's power to convene to bring together some of New Zealand's leading researchers and lift expert knowledge into the heart of our considerations as a country. One of the most critical national conversations we're having today is to understand and prepare for our changing population, particularly as our population ages. It's so critical that the evidence base can inform our decision making. I'd like now to pass across to Dr. Andrew Jackson, Program Director at the Policy Hub. Thank you again, Andrew, for supporting our collaboration.
Good morning, everyone. So this is what we're going to do today. I'm going to give a quick recap of previous seminars we've run on this subject. Then we've got 4 wonderful experts who will be giving their views on how we should prepare for our changing population. This is the 4th in a series of seminars we've had. The first one was on understanding the possible futures of New Zealand. The next one on the economic and social outcomes and the implications of climate change for our population. And the last one on affording our future, which looked at healthcare, infrastructure demands, and the fiscal implications. And those presentations considered natural changes to our population, the impact of immigration on the population. The population would increase, age, urbanize, and diversify with effects on our infrastructure, the number of people in rural areas, healthcare, pensions, and workforce. And then these were the implications that they considered. And my task this morning is to give a very, very brief summary of those 9 presentations, and I've got about 10 or 11 minutes to do it. So this is a very, very quick run through of looking at this landscape, because what we want to do today is to focus on how New Zealand should respond. All of the experts recognise that there were issues that were emerging because of the population. So now we're going to say, well, what should we do to respond to the changes that we can see that are emerging in relation to our population? So what they highlighted was the changes to our population raise a number of important issues. The first is, where do we get people from in the future who will do the work as our population ages? What should we do about our retirement policies to ensure that our policies are affordable? What are the implications for public health as we age? How do we ensure that key services are available in rural areas as people age and move into the urban and peri-urban areas? What does all of this mean for our immigration settings, fiscal policy, and finally, do we need to have a population national 10-year plan or strategy, whatever you want to call it, given all of these issues that are emerging because of the changes of population? Kai2 have produced a paper recently which explores that, which has got some great information and analysis in, and we're here to debate these issues today. So over to the summary. What did the experts say in those first 3? I'm going to go through this very, very quickly. What I've included in every slide is the person who was the speaker who spoke to the slide and gave so much more detail. So if you would like to see more or learn more about what those individuals said, you can look at those individuals' presentations on the Policy Hub website and listen to them speak and give their 20 minutes. So now, very, very quickly, what is the background? New Zealand's future population will be shaped by declining fertility rates and net immigration. Current fertility rate is about 1.53. You need 2.1 to maintain the population. So by around 2050, on current trends, New Zealand's population would start to decline if we did not have net positive immigration. Different forecasts by Stats New Zealand of what our population will look like out to 2078. Some quite different possibilities there. Out to 2051, between 6 million of us and over 7 million. Out to 2078, between 6.6 and 9 million. If you look at these, what Stats New Zealand did, which was very interesting, is they looked at also what happens in a high migration future and a no migration future. And then you get some quite different potential futures. And you can see here out to 2078, close to 12 million. Or if we have low net migration, seeing a declining population from around 2040 going down to about 4.7 or something over the future. And what this highlighted and highlights is the importance of immigration policy and net immigration in terms of our future population. So one of the presenters provided a model of the factors which affect the levels of migration. And I'm going to talk a little bit based on the presentations that were given on the environmental factors and the political factors which will shape the number of people who want to come here. One of the presenters said that we could face millions wanting to come to New Zealand under current policies because of climate change. And they looked at a best case if we're able to maintain the rise in temperature below 2 degrees, and maybe there'll be a few thousand migrants who want to come to live in New Zealand. But if it gets closer to 3 degrees, then the view was of the expert that there would be millions of people wanting to come to New Zealand as we move towards the end of the century. So which is the pathway we're on? Are we closer currently climate change wise to 2 degrees or 3 degrees? And there's some very, very useful information here. On current policies, we're much, much closer to the 2.7 degrees. And as a consequence, over the next 60 or 70 years, facing millions of people wanting to come to New Zealand. I won't go through this slide. On the political side, we saw changes to liberal world order leading to increasing international instability. And we learned that from a historical point of view, as you move away from the liberal world order, either to a bipolar or multipolar world, it will lead to increased armed conflict and increasing forced migration. And with that, you'll see more people wanting to move, but also challenges domestically as people become more hostile. And we're starting to see this already to migrants wanting to, to domestic populations wanting migrants to come to their country. So pressure for people to move, but also internally pressure for people not to come to the country. Another aspect of the population is aging, as we've heard. So going from 20% over 65, it's currently 17%, to 22% by 2050. And by 2030, as you can't see it, it's about a third of the population would be over 65. In addition, New Zealand will see increasing ethnic diversity, and we'll see some quite big changes there. Where we'll see the number of Europeans change from about 65% to about 52% of the population on current trends within the next 25 years, increasing continuing Maori and Pacifica, and increasing number of Asians from about 20 to 33%. So increasing diversity as a nation with significant differences in diversity by region. And here's a striking example of this, of the number of 0 to 14 Maoris in regions, with Gisborne seeing close to 80% in not a too long a period either. And within 20 years, 3/4 of the country will live in the top half of North Island. So we're seeing increasing numbers, aging population, increasing diversity, but also movement of where people live, with headlines like this: rural towns fighting for survival. And one of the experts explained that in the forward plans of many of the regions, they are overestimating the number of people that will come to their regions in order to attract investment, but it's probably not a realistic assessment. Then we looked at some of the myths. So we're seeing these changes. What does it mean? Does it mean that we're not going to be able to afford infrastructure? And what we heard was infrastructure scales with population growth. So it stays affordable to build that extra infrastructure. And those are the sort of high level, and there's the low level forecasts. But actually, the difference is marginal in terms of whether it's affordable. It's a tiny, tiny difference. So if there is growth, 1-2% of our population, it's affordable and it shouldn't cause a problem with our infrastructure. However, it does cause a problem if there's a decline in the population numbers because you end up having stranded assets, or if there is uncertainty. And here's an example of the uncertainty. So how much money should be invested in education capital stocks? And this graph shows a lot less, declining by up to 10%. This one shows increases of up to 10%. And this is Stats New Zealand, lower forecast of population growth and higher forecast. So it's possible to afford the changes in infrastructure. If we're growing at 1-2%, it becomes a problem if there's a decline or there's uncertainty. So one of the recommendations, and the Infrastructure Commission has put a range of them out, is that the New Zealand should have a national sectoral plan that explores and deals with issues around population changes of the future. But will it cause house price bubbles? Does it displace New Zealanders from jobs? And what we heard was a 1% increase in net migration leads just to a 0.5% to 1% increase in rates, and maybe a 1-2% increase in house prices. So it doesn't have a significant effect on either of those, and neither does it have a big effect on native wages, on the wages of the incumbents in the country. So both of those are myths that people use to say, actually, no, it's a bad thing. Well, no, these are both myths. And migrant support economic growth. This is another piece of research that was looked at. Currently about 20,000 net immigrants per year. This was a study looking at if you doubled that, what would it do? Actually, you see GDP go up by about 7%. And if you go the other way and you don't have any migration over the period, the estimate was that you would see a decrease in net GDP, gross domestic product, by about 11%. Health outcomes also explored. What are the health outcomes? And one will explain that actually we know the types of things that lead to mortality, and we know the factors that determine the health and long-term health. And so it's possible, given the fact we know that, to improve the health outcomes for an aging population by addressing determinants now. There was a report today on child poverty, and there's a good example of, sorry, a bad example, unfortunate example of housing, and a number of 12-year-olds who experience homelessness before the age of 12, which is a travesty. So addressing these issues now is key, not just to addressing those issues now, but also for our long-term future as we seek to wrestle with the changes to our population. That was a very, very quick run through. Now, some of the challenges and strategic choices for New Zealand. The ratio of workers to pensioners will decrease from 3.9 to 2.8 by 2050. So what approach should we do to secure our future workforce? And if we do decide to grow slowly and age fast, how do we manage that as we have fewer people? Or if we decide, do we want to grow more quickly through more immigrants? How do we ensure we invest in outcomes? And we heard from the speakers the things that we need to do to ensure that those people who come to our shores have a good outcome and there is a good social outcome for the nation. And now it's over for you to have a chance to have your say. We've got these as questions. And Valerie, if you could just get these questions up, and then everyone who's attending can get a chance to give your views on how we should respond to this. How should we ensure New Zealand has a future workforce that it needs? And how should we manage delivery of key services? Now, Valerie, should I stop sharing screen for a second so you can show people how to vote? Oh, okay, fantastic. If people would like to vote on those, I'll just give you a second to have a look. So poll question 1. I'll just give you a second to do that, and then I'll move on to the next questions. There are hands being raised at the moment. I don't know whether people are able to do this. So I'm going to move on to the next one. There are points in chat. I'm going to look at those. I'm going to stop sharing screen just for a second to check. Questions disappeared before I fully read them. The poll questions have disappeared, people are saying. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to close that for now. I will move on to the other questions, and then hopefully at some point we'll be able to find a way so that everyone is able to participate in those. So those are the questions, the first ones for debate, how we should ensure we have a future workforce and how we should manage our rural population where there is declining. The next one is average income tax.
So sorry, Andrew. I've just shared the results so people can see they were voting when they came in. Someone has said. Otherwise, yeah, happy to go ahead and share the second poll.
Okay, we'll do that in a second. So the average income tax would need to increase from 21% to 32% to stabilise debt. Sorry, I'll get rid of that again. And this was driven by increasing healthcare super. The interest costs go up by 6 times and defence costs go up by 4 times. So you've got this critical issue, should we increase tax or reduce cost? So here's the second poll. How should we manage the cost of pensions? When should New Zealand increase the pension age? And how should we manage the increasing costs of healthcare? So you've got an opportunity now to put your thoughts in on that. Wow, that's fascinating already. I'll just give people a few seconds to answer that. And then I'll move on to the last questions, and we'll then be able to pass on to the experts who will be able to give their views on these issues. Very interesting. Majority are going for mean testing.
Andrew, just to mention, we're coming to the end of your...
Okay, perfect, because I've got one more, absolutely perfect. So in that case, I'll move on to the next question while people are just finishing that one. Just going to move that over there so people can continue to see what's going on. One of the other things is we live in a democracy, and the challenge of a democracy is the political imperative is to look at short-term rather than longer-term issues, hence the challenges we have with issues like population. So here's the last poll for you to ask the question, given we have these uncertainties, should we have a population strategy, and how should we ensure good long-term planning for New Zealand? And last one, important one for Royal Society, what is the key data we need, and what are the research gaps that we need to solve so that we have the information we need so the population strategy is good? We already have an immense amount of information, but are there gaps? So I'll just give a few minutes on this one. Actually, I probably haven't got a minute, have I? I've got a minute. So while you're doing that one, I will just go to my final point as people are thinking about this. So this is a quote I am very aware of, and it rings true so often. Want of foresight, unwillingness to act, lack of clear thinking, confusion of counsel until the emergency comes, until self-preservation strikes its jarring gong. These are the features which constitute the endless repetition of history. So the question I'll leave everybody with is that the state and situation that we will see as New Zealand seems to wait on the edge of information rather than responding to population changes? Or will we do something that's proactive and prove Winston Churchill wrong? So Simon, I'll stop sharing now and I'll hand back to you.
Thank you, Andrew. Kia ora koutou, no mai, haere mai, ko Simon Wilson taku ingoa. I'm an Auckland journalist, a listener columnist, formerly at the New Zealand Herald. You can find me these days at a Substack called Hotetown. Don't we need it? My job today is to introduce Paul Spoonley and our other panellists and share a conversation among them. Distinguished Professor Emeritus Paul Spoonley, ONZM, is one of New Zealand's leading social scientists. He's a Fellow of the Royal Society, as well as Auckland Museum, a Research Fellow at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity in Germany, and a Senior Fellow at COITU, the Centre for Important Futures. Paul's been studying immigration, diversity, and the shifting nature of work and political ideologies for decades. He's the population guy. Paul.
Thank you, Simon. So one of the tasks that I was given was to look at what was happening. Oh, stop sharing. Was to look at what's happening internationally, and my screen does. And so, as Andrew has kindly pointed out, we produced a report about a month ago, which looked at the reasons for a population strategy in New Zealand. And what we did was a quick look around the world to see what other countries were doing. And so I really want to talk to you a little bit about that, about the framing of the issues, but also the way in which other countries have responded. When you look internationally, the way in which population change has been framed tends to be quite dramatic, melodramatic at times, but nevertheless, we're entering a very new period where, as we proceed through to mid-century, and as Andrew has outlined with regard to New Zealand, the changed demography of countries really does begin to ask some questions of our policy settings and the way in which we approach major political decisions. We've got this is the UN World Population Prospects, which I would recommend to anybody who's interested in population change. But you can see it's, again, the baby bust and the way in which fertility is being described. What's significant here, I think, when you look at this type of graphic, is the way in which it's a global change that's occurring. Yes, sub-Saharan Africa is different, but when you look at many of our trading partners, our countries that are similar to us, then they are facing very much the same issues. And I think the way in which Andrew has articulated the issues, we tend to be at the back end of the queue. Our fertility decline has been relatively recent compared to others. And of course, what we need to say is that there are significant parts of the population where the fertility pattern is quite different, notably Māori and Pacifica. So the OECD has a major project on this, and as you can see, they have continued the theme, which is often focused around fertility decline. And so I've got two graphics from a recent report of theirs concerning social indicators, and you can see that there's a focus on childlessness, but there's also an indicator of what they think are the major factors affecting fertility decline. I actually disagree with this single framing where fertility becomes the major issue, but I also disagree with the way in which they've articulated the factors for fertility decline. I think it is much more complex than that. So, yes, it's a significant issue internationally. The question is whether countries are doing much about it. And the European Commission and OECD launched a project in 2023. So I've got, it was impossible to try and cover every possibility, but I've got two examples. One of them will be Finland, the other will be Singapore. But OECD have got this shrinking smartly and sustainably. Now, about a decade ago, some of us, including Tahu Kukata, who's on this call, produced a book called Rebooting the Regions. And we discovered very quickly the local body politicians' aversion to ever talking about shrinking or decline. So we had a concept there of smart decline, and we looked at how communities were reacting to population stagnation or decline. But you can see here the European Commission and OECD have a major project. I've picked out some of the key elements of it, only 5 of them. As you can see, I've been quite selective. But does speak to what we're facing in New Zealand, the question of evidence and anticipating change, recognising that demography plays out quite differently depending upon where you are. The idea of trying to contribute to resilient and inclusive communities, coordination and fiscal resilience, given the changing demographic context. So for me, this is a good way of articulating an agenda for what we're experiencing demographically. You can see here the main trends and drivers, but what I wanted to draw your attention to are the policy implications that we need to mitigate demographic change. So here you can see an echo of some of the language around climate change, that it be place-based, that it be integrated, that it ensure fiscal stability and viability. And when you look at New Zealand, and when you reflect on some of the comments that Andrew and others have made, what you realise is that some of our territorial authorities that need significant additional ratepayer funding, for example, with water, are actually also the territorial authorities that have the highest rates of those on fixed incomes, notably superannuation. So that place-based becomes super important in this context. And I would argue that we probably haven't had enough strategic foresight around demography in this country. So here we've got an example where you're looking at the anticipated additional health and welfare costs. Now, again, I've got a slight concern about this, in that all of the narrative is around the increase in cost, and they are definitely cost. A lot of the narrative is around the way in which we anticipate the impacts on our fertility, on our costs of aging and of healthcare, and then what we're doing around fertility. Yes, there are issues, but how are we going to respond to this in ways that change that narrative to one that anticipates the changes and then begins to develop policies that are appropriate in this environment? Now, I come to Finland, and I want to start with this, which is only part of what the Finnish report talks about, but it does talk about the negative feedback loop, which builds upon the issue, the comment that I've made around narratives. And it is very easy to get into that negative feedback loop that is a response, or one response to demographic change. And I think there's a lesson here that it is easy to buy into that negative feedback loop around what we need to do, what the issues are. So what is Finland doing? Well, Finland, I think, is an interesting example of a country that is looking at its institutional and policy settings and asking whether or not those settings are appropriate to make the call around demographic change. So what they talk, as you can see here, and I've again been quite selective, they talk about multi-level coordination, about foresight and administrative capacity in shrinking context. And this is one that's very current in New Zealand. Territorial mergers as a response to demographic and fiscal pressures. And this is the one that I think we ought to come back to, because the Productivity Commission, in one of its final reports, did talk about immigration and did talk about some of the things that they thought were important, including a policy statement. And here we've got the Finns talking about citizen engagement in terms of getting the New Zealand, in this case, New Zealand public, to understand what the issues are and to take part in an informed debate about the possibilities. What the Finns have identified as key factors are the ones that you see here: the workforce shortages, the improvement of preventative care using digital services, the possibility of cooperation, particularly between municipal governments and using digital learning, optimizing existing infrastructure and housing, And when you think about housing in New Zealand and its appropriateness for what's going to emerge in terms of our new demography. On the right, you can see the multi-level governance, service delivery, and subnational finance and investment. So subnational, they're really meaning local area financing. And then they've got what they call the smart adaptation mandate. So going back to that citizenship participation, what does that mandate look like in terms of a public? My second example is Singapore. So Singapore's part of our neighbourhood, as it were. As you can see, they're beginning to see very significant demographic changes. This is not new. Singapore tried to address fertility decline way back in 1986, and it's had various phases of addressing fertility decline. As you can see, it has not had any impact upon Singapore's fertility rate, which is anticipated that will drop below 1. Korea is the lowest currently at the moment at 0.7, but as you can see, Singapore is anticipated to drop to 0.87. And it's an interesting question to ask, what would we expect in terms of New Zealand fertility rate? So how has Singapore responded to this? Well, they have a population brief that they produce. And what I've done is I've taken two things from it. One is the major headings, and as you can see, it frames population change and what they want to do about it in a very unique Singaporean way in terms of what does the overall population size look like, longevity, marriage and parenthood, and then immigration and citizens by descent. And then what you've got as part of that report is how they characterize their citizens. And it is an interesting framing. CMP, I think, is chemical and mechanical processing, by the way, if you're looking at the detail of it. But what it does is it characterizes the population in terms of citizenship or non-citizenship status. That's a very unique thing, which I think echoes what we're seeing around the world, which is that one of the levers that we have is immigration, but many countries are framing immigration and the impact of immigration and cultural diversity as being an issue. What is surprising to me, and which I think is very relative to New Zealand, is the way in which indigeneity is framed and understood. So we have here the population policy for Singapore, which was produced in October 2024. What it is a quite neutral framing of the issues. As you can see, sustainability is important. Opportunities, economic opportunities are important. There is the issues around how you create an inclusive and cohesive society, which I think is framed very much in terms of native Singaporeans, however they're defined, and incomers. The subtext here is how to reverse fertility decline. That is a huge preoccupation of Singaporean politicians. But the other subtext is who should be a Singaporean citizen or resident by right. And the sustainability, cohesiveness, inclusiveness are really very much focused around this. So this is my final slide. When we did that brief survey as part of Koitu, and what I did in preparation for this is look at what was happening internationally. And what I'm puzzled by, and which I think is important for New Zealand, a lesson for New Zealand, is that all of the components, the aging, the fertility, the location of the population, diversity, including indigeneity, tangata whenua as part of that, and of course immigration. Bringing all those elements together in terms of a planning process or document is actually very hard to find. There is a large focus, a primary focus, as you can see, on pro-natalist policies. How do we reverse fertility decline? And very often in this, I think we need to be careful in the New Zealand context, because we are not like other countries. We're certainly like Australia and Canada, but immigration is framed as being problematic as one of the levers that you can use. What I think we ought to take notice of is the way in which these issues, the evidence, and the policies are being explored in terms of communities in place, and that a national policy is not very conducive to regions. And I would argue that our immigration policy in New Zealand is a national policy which does not reflect the needs, aspirations, ambitions of our regions very well at all. And then there's the question of the institutional settings for this. And what I hope I've made clear is that the OECD is very focused on how we address these issues, both in terms of the evidence, but also the process. And that's why I thought that Finland and its citizenship engagement was a really interesting approach. And what would that look like in New Zealand? So are there examples that I would refer us to? Yes, but only in part. Is there a country which has an overall policy which is responding to demographic change, which includes all of the elements? Actually, it's very, very difficult to find. So I think we need to look overseas for best practice, but we might not find something which can give us the whole answer. And we will need, as always, to develop our own answer. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you again, Paul. I'm going to introduce our three remaining panelists and ask each of them to take about 5 minutes to respond to what Paul's saying and introduce the key issues they'd like us to talk about. And then we will pick up some of those questions. Tahu Kukutai is photography at Te Herenga Institute of Population Research in Waikato and co-director of Ngāpai Aotearoa Māori Centre for Research Excellence. Tahu specialises in Māori and demography and data sovereignty as a fellow of the Royal Society Te Apārangi, the Life Association of New Zealand. Fully Ata is also at Te Herenga Institute of Population Research, where she's an associate professor of population health. Polly is a public health and medicine specialist at Whakapora, Waikato. The work focuses on measuring and improving broader determinants of population health and well-being, particularly tamari. Hi. Dr. Patrick Nolan oversees a range of research programs, policy reviews, and statutory monitoring roles in the retirement sector. He has previously worked for the Treasury Product Commission, the Institute of Economic Research. Tahu, we'll start.
O kia ora, e mihi ana ki a koutou, e te ata nei. Hopefully you can hear me. You were breaking up a little bit, Simon, and I'm not sure if it's you or this connection, but I'm hoping that...
You're very clear to me, so it's probably...
Okay, great. That's good. Well, thank you. I think we've got about 5 minutes, so I'll just get straight into it. Look, I just want to start by saying Aotearoa is not in a state of demographic crisis. I want to say that clearly because the word crisis gets sort of bandied around a lot in population debates. Compared with many advanced economies, our situation is relatively benign. As Andrew noted, our total fertility rate sits at about 1.5 children per woman. Yes, that's below replacement, but it's at the OECD average. Our population is still growing. Births are projected to outpace deaths for some decades yet. In nearly every country in Europe, deaths exceed births, and it's been that case for some time. In Italy, Poland, and Germany, it's approaching nearly twice as many deaths and births. We're nowhere near that at the moment. And we don't, as Paul said, we don't face the acute immigration integration challenges that we see in France or Germany. However, the lessons from elsewhere is very clear that governments that wait for crisis before acting consistently find themselves acting too late. We don't want that. So what should we do? Well, maybe we know what we shouldn't do. The evidence shows really clearly that interventions to boost fertility, for example, just simply don't work. South Korea has produced poured billions of dollars into exactly that kind of program with almost nothing to show for it. And as Paul talked about, same with Singapore. So for sure, the most promising path forward is adaptation, reshaping our institutions, our investments, our policy settings to work with our demographic reality. And we need a really robust evidence base of about what that reality looks like. We need to work with it rather than against it. And I think, there's a crucial point that adaptation, it needs to be fit for purpose for this country. We're not Finland, we're not Singapore. Yes, we have similar sized populations, roughly 5.5 million each, but our demographic composition, our policy context are completely different. And I think Paul alluded to that as well. Finland effectively erases ethnicity from its population data. Singapore assigns citizens a rigid state designated racial category. Neither of these approaches would be appropriate here, where ethnicity is a foundational public policy variable and anchored in our te tiriti o Waitangi responsibilities. And our population composition is very different as well. Aotearoa, New Zealand is genuinely unique in the OECD in that we have both a large Indigenous population. Māori make up somewhere between 17 and 20% of the population, depending on the measure used. And if you look at the tamariki population, 0 to 14, that's 28, edging up to 30% Māori. That's huge. And we also have a very large migrant population with nearly 30% born overseas. There's no other OECD country that sits at that intersection of having both of these very distinctive population demographic features. So any serious population strategy has to be grounded in that reality from the outset, not a cut and paste from another country with some faffing about the edges, but centrally grounded in that reality, where diversity isn't an afterthought, it's actually a foundational design principle. And you can see the importance of these compositional differences simply by eyeballing an age structure. Anyone can do that. You don't have to be a demographic expert. So if you look at the population age structures, the median age for Māori is about 27 years. For Pacific peoples, it's about 25 years. And the age structures, they look like triangles. So triangles have significant population momentum, and that means that they're going to keep growing even after fertility drops below replacement level. You're still going to see growth there for some decades afterwards. For the Pākehā European population, the median age is closer to 42 years. And so, the age structure looks more like a sausage or a column. Or I like to use the word sausage because people get that. Everyone knows what a sausage looks like. So it's relatively even with a sort of a fatter top. And that European population has essentially completed its demographic transition, and it's aging rapidly through that sort of double whammy of low fertility and much smaller cohorts moving into the reproductive ages. And the Asian population structure is like a kite, bulging in the working age populations influenced by migration. So these are not minor statistical differences, these are massive differences, and they reflect profoundly different demographic histories and trajectories, and those histories shape the present and they also shape the future. And I should note that a sausage can't become a triangle. There's no country in the world where a population in the world where a sausage has become a triangle, and you can't affect any change like that through fertility interventions or migration policy settings. It simply doesn't work. So what does this mean? It means it makes no sense to design for population futures based on a sausage. And if we do that, not only will we be mismatching policy to needs, but we'll be missing critical opportunities. And demographer Natalie Jackson, who was one of my former colleagues, she wrote about this opportunity at length in what she called the collateral demographic dividend. And it really arises as a relatively youthful Māori population, and I would say Pacific population as well, coexist along a structurally older counterpart, and together they sort of comprise this economic dividend system. And as the Pākehā population sort of ages out of the workforce, Māori and Pacific workers are structurally positioned to move in and become a much higher share of the working age population, not because of any policy intervention and not because of any sinister agenda, but simply because of the contrasting age structures of these populations side by side in one country. But that window of opportunity of a potential demographic dividend arising from these triangular population structures is not limitless. It is time-bound. It is a moment in time, and it requires timely investment at two stages as those large cohorts move into the working ages, but also as those cohorts move into the peak earning years in the older working age groups. Arguably that time was a decade ago. So, this is not a peripheral concern. I guess the bottom line is, future-proofing Aotearoa's demographic settings requires sustained and serious and timely investment in Māori and Pacific communities as a demographic and as an economic necessity. And I'm going to stop there because I think I've probably used my little 5 minutes. And ka tuku te rākau ki a koe, Polly. Thank you.
Kia ora tahu. And Polly, over to you.
O tēnei te mihi ki a koutou katoa me ki a koe e hoa tahu, ngā mihi mahana ki a koe. So I just wanted to pick up on Tahu's kōrero and Paul's kōrero and really raise 3 points when we think about future-proofing Aotearoa, preparing for the population changes ahead, the title of our hui today. And really, I think we need to, as Tahu has said, we need to understand a little bit more about what we know is happening right now. And from a health perspective, as Andrew showed, what we know is happening right now is that our burden of disease is largely preventable. So we have global burden of disease in adulthood metrics that demonstrate that of 85% of our burden of disease, healthy life lost, early mortality is the result of non-communicable diseases, and the majority of those, again around about 85% of those, are preventable. In childhood, we have over 60,000 hospitalizations of our children for preventable disease every year. These are obviously enormously costly, and while we may not have a crisis with respect to our demographic changes, we respond to our health concerns through largely crisis management in the health sector currently. We don't have strong, comprehensive, preventable primary care, nor do we act on what we know are the determinants, the causes of these incredibly expensive and preventable hospitalizations and health need. These are the issues that we have just heard some more about. They are the cost of our housing instability, what we see in Paul presented in Finland around housing instability. I think Paul talked about for the new demography, we need to be thinking about housing, but we actually need to be thinking about what we are doing to ensure we have safe, stable, healthy housing for our population right now. When we think about those child preventable health statistics, we know the impact of child poverty on our children and the direct relationship between these socioeconomic considerations, determinants, and health outcomes that we are responding to with respect to this kind of crisis response, rather than leaning into the dividend that pays through preventative activity, particularly in the life course and early intervention for our tamariki and our rangatahi. So that's what we know with respect to the importance and impact of preventable disease. And we also know that we have stark and enduring inequities in those health outcomes here in Aotearoa. So the vast majority of that burden is borne, overrepresented burden is borne by Māori and Pacific communities. Māori health inequities are stark and enduring and can be seen across pretty much every health measure that we measure. And these inequities are by definition avoidable. So actually, not only do they provide a moral incentive for action and an incentive that aligns with the breach of Te Tiriti o Waitangi that they represent, but they also provide a fiscal and productivity incentive for action when we think about our future, and when we think about the fact that our tamariki and rangatahi are the workforce for the future. So as Tahu noted, this is our moment. In fact, we may have had that moment a decade ago, as Tahu noted, in order to really act on the child, the youth, inequities in health outcomes and in the exposure to the determinants of health, which will have a cumulative benefit, not just in health outcomes. And then the final point really that I wanted to make is that we've heard a lot by the speakers today around thinking through things like strategic foresight and demography, understanding the role of migration, understanding internal migration patterns, forced migration, the impact of climate change on Aotearoa's demography, and thinking through the particular relationship that we have with our Pacific neighbours, not just our realm countries, and the role that climate change will play on migration patterns, and is indeed playing on migration patterns now. We also heard a lot about different demographic patterns where we are in place-based policies. But in order to really understand that, we know that we've got these massive changes in our data infrastructure and in our evidence base for a lot of our actions. With the loss of a census, a population, full enumeration population census, it's going to be very difficult for us to understand the true demographic changes that we experience. And also it's going to be very difficult to ensure that we prioritise evidence for pro-equity, which will be evidence for fiscal prudence, as well as understanding what and valuing the evidence and information that community can provide towards making sure that our actions will land. I think that's probably my time there, Simon, so I'll leave it at that. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou katoa.
Kia ora, Polly. Patrick.
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation to speak today, and what a great way to start a Monday morning with a discussion on these issues. When I was thinking about what to say today, and this might seem like a strange metaphor, but my mind kept coming back to the when I was young, watching the New Zealand men's cricket team in the 1990s, and I can almost hear at the back of my head the Australian commentators talking about the ability of that team to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. And the reason this comes to mind is I kind of wonder if this is what's going to happen to us when New Zealand, when we're thinking about how we respond to population aging and issues like retirement policy and the future cost of health policy. You know, because if you look at it now, we're in pretty good shape, but I'm not sure that we're really up for the hard work that will be needed to ensure that we make the most of this as the world continues to evolve. And to explain, in my 5 minutes, I'll just talk about the good, the bad, and the policy. So first of all, the good. And as Fred Dagg sang, often in New Zealand, we don't know how lucky we are. Our retirement system, you know, let's just focus on that. Our retirement system is coherent, and the different parts of it make a lot of sense. So we have New Zealand Super, which is very good at addressing pensioner poverty, or what the economist Nicholas Barr calls the Robin Hood function of the system. We have KiwiSaver, which can help households smooth their incomes over their lives, which he calls the piggy bank function. We have relatively simple tax treatment of pensions, and the New Zealand Super Fund will help offset some, but only some, of the increase in costs of New Zealand Super after about 2050. In terms of fiscal costs to the government, we're at the lower end of the OECD and expected to remain there. And while there will be fewer workers available for every retired person, we won't be as bad as many other OECD countries. And we've also seen a narrowing of some pay gaps over the last 25 years and technological changes providing opportunities for New Zealand. But what about the bad? So while we know that gender and ethnic pay gaps have been narrowing, they're still there. And we also know that since the disruption of COVID, some of the positive trends in areas like education have stalled or even started to turn around. If we focus on the over 65 population, retirement isn't what it used to be. Although it's lower than the population as a whole, there is an increasing incidence of material hardship, especially for people who rent or fully rely on New Zealand super for income. And as a result, governments are now spending more on supplementary assistance, such as accommodation support and special needs grants for the over 65 population. And while our spending on pensions is low in comparative terms, it is a major area of spending. We now spend more on New Zealand super than we do on education. Indeed, if you look at the increase in New Zealand super spending in the last budget, just the increase alone was equivalent to around 2/3 of all business spending on research and development in New Zealand. So there is a question about, as an economy, is that really where we want resources to be going? And our use of technology and productivity among firms is not where it needs to be, which means that too often we pursue growth through focusing on increasing hours of work or using environmental assets like water. So what about policy? So where does that fit in all of this? Well, I think when it comes to these long-term policy issues, the importance of trust can't be overstated. People need time to adapt to change, and this requires policy to be consistent and coherent. If we look at the history of reforms in New Zealand, the ones that have endured over the long term have shared these characteristics. They've been grounded in evidence and strong analysis rather than being driven by political considerations. I think we also need to focus on what truly matters and avoid distractions. Timing is crucial. The longer we delay discussions about necessary changes, the harder it will be to implement them. With our population aging, we will soon have 1 million people over the age of 65. We'll have more people over the age of 65 than we all have under 15. So the longer we wait, the more people will be affected by any transition. And then, as some of the other panelists and presenters have noted, I think it's important to think carefully about the narrative. We shouldn't treat population aging as a problem to be solved, but as an opportunity. But I think we also need to be realistic. We need to be realistic about the need to make choices and the need to understand some of the distributional questions. Because if you look at the main barrier to stabilisation policies, or why stabilisations are delayed, it is actually distributional questions that tend to be the barrier. But if we get this right, then I think we will really continue to be a lucky country. Not only will we improve retirement outcomes for all New Zealanders, but we'll be putting our economy on a stronger footing by developing deeper capital markets, more firm investment, and more productivity. And we'll be giving future governments greater choices over where they spend their money. Now, I have a 10-year-old daughter, and I hope we can do that, because that's the sort of country that will give her and all young New Zealanders the opportunities they deserve. Thank you. That's my 5 minutes.
Kia ora, Patrick. Thank you so much for that, and thank you to everybody. A sausage can't become a triangle, he said. We've also been reminded that there are stark and enduring inequities in our health system that cannot be forgotten as we develop population strategies, or an overarching one of how we approach it. Tahu and Patrick have both told us we're not in a demographic crisis, and the situation is not as bad as some other countries in the OECD, but of course we also heard that millions of people may be wanting to come to live here this century. And Paul has told us that perhaps one of the key things we need to do is find a way to develop a smart application mandate. Paul, I wonder if I could call on you first if you have any responses to any of the things that the panelists have told us.
I wouldn't mind hearing more from Patrick about the distributional issues that he sees as being critical, and what are the most important there. But no, I think that the way in which all of the presenters have talked about the particularities of Aotearoa New Zealand are crucially important. And for me, I am really concerned about where we're heading in terms of developing or continuing to develop a database. The possibility that we're not going to have a census, I think, is hugely concerning when it comes to questions of population, equity, justice, appropriate policy settings. So I think that we need to develop something. My two responses, Simon, are we need to develop something which is talks about this place at this point, and that we don't need to catastrophize it. I think it has been catastrophized in other countries, but then they're well down a demographic transition pathway, which is quite different to New Zealand. And I think that the point that you've made at the very end there around how we actually had that discussion and the way in which we choose to develop our policies, given these demographic changes, is actually quite critical. It's the how, which I think is going to be quite a challenge.
And I assume you would agree there are two parts to the how. One is development of policy, and the other is the development of popular support.
Yes. No, I'm just a bit gobsmacked, really, that we started an election campaign sometime around November last year, and that we're politicizing what are really important issues. We in the COI2 report suggested that we need to take, in this case, population. I would suggest other things, actually, infrastructure, education, health, take it out of the political arena to some extent, and then get some more strategic thinking. But it's just not realistic at the moment, and that's what worries me, that we're heading into an election campaign where some of these things are going to be politicized in very unhelpful ways. And how can we move beyond that? The politicization, but the way in which we see quite divergent communities. And I would suggest those communities are not particularly well informed about some of these issues. So, how do we inform people and have that conversation?
The media do a good job. I hope that any of the panelists feel free to jump in at any stage. Paul asked you to elaborate a little.
Yeah, well, thank you. If I could just give one example, say a change to the age of eligibility for New Zealand super. It's sometimes described as quite a simple policy change, and in some respects, at a very macro level, it is. But if you think about differences in longevity among different population groups, so we know Māori have sort of lower lifespans than sort of non-Māori, so you're going to have quite an impact on different different ethnic groups. You also see there's a gender dimension, so we know that again, Māori have lower participation in KiwiSaver. We know that the difference between men and women's KiwiSaver balances, there's a real difference there, so it's about 25%. So if you make a change to one setting, say the age of eligibility for New Zealand super, you do have to understand that it's going to impact on different population groups in quite different ways. So it's really important to understand if there's other parts of the system that also need to change. So for example, if we look at gender, one thing you could do is you could think about maybe extra support for people who take time out for parental leave to continue their KiwiSaver contributions to reduce some of that gap growing over time. So, that's just one practical example of how some of these distributional questions can actually be a barrier to reform. And actually the way to address them is to think about systems more generally and how you can actually design a whole package of reform that not just has one aspect which might have cost, but you can have compensation through other parts of a package.
I wonder if I could come to you. You mentioned the need for adaptation strategies that are fit for purpose, which is a similar thing to what Paul suggested with the smart adaptation mandate. Any thoughts on the how?
Yeah, thanks. So look, I think the broader institutional gap, I think, is that we have no population approach, plan, strategy at all. And You know, some of this is new, some of this isn't. We used to have a demographer at our population centre, Ian Poole, who was saying there was a bunch of the New Zealand Planning Council in the 1980s and the 1990s saying pretty much exactly the same thing that we're saying now, and nothing's happened. So you know, so I guess I'm a little skeptical, and in the context of you know, the run up to election and the points that Paul made about sort of dog whistling around immigration and other issues, I'm skeptical that there'll be any movement in the near future to develop a serious population strategy or adaptation approach in the way that we actually require. The Treasury has a long-term fiscal statement which sort of models that population-related pressures, ageing, labour force participation, health expenditure out to about 40 years, I think it is. So that's a good start, but we need to build on that and to be really clear about where intervention is genuinely feasible and where evidence-based adaptation is more fruitful. And the point I made about the triangle and the sausage is that, you know, often in those sort of evidence-based adaptation discourse and initiatives, it becomes all about the sausage, you know? And one of the opportunities, one of the several opportunities we have here in Aotearoa in terms of adaptation, the structurally youthful Māori and Pacific populations, the need for that sort of strategic investment at different parts of the life course. And of course, there's a challenge there, which is the distributional issues that Dr. Nolan was talking about as well. You know, this is not a level playing field. And so we need to be pretty creative about what that adaptation and investment looks like. If I think about where I live in Waikato, you know, it's still one of the faster growing regions, and that's projected, not forecast, because the population projections are not forecasts. That's projected to be the case, you know, for decades to come. It also has a relatively high Māori population and a youthful population. So in terms of adaptation, you know, national averages don't mean a lot. You need to adapt in place, and you know, you need to have sort of a more nuanced approach that actually takes account of what that population composition looks like more at the regional level. And so here in Waikato, you know, Waikato Tainui is a major regional stakeholder economically, socially, culturally, and politically. And so I think there's real opportunity there to take quite a relentless rangatahi investment approach. And there's creative ways to do that through kura initiatives like Puhoro STEM and so forth. So I think there are opportunities beyond a sort of a traditional paradigm of centralised national government, top-down policy making. I think that there are multiple ways to adapt using sort of local decision making as well.
So can I just attempt to sum up what you just said, that there are enormous opportunities and in fact needs that we have as a society to develop Māori opportunities and outcomes in health and housing, education and employment. But perhaps some of the forces that are holding that back are pretty much the same forces that are also arguing against immigration. So we're caught in a situation as a society where we're not progressing on either front in any kind of socially cohesive way.
Yeah, that's true, Simon. But look, I think people can become really overwhelmed with, you know, there's just like so much information on population. And there is no smoking gun solution to any of this. So some of it is, you know, like births and deaths change slowly. And once a certain momentum has taken hold, it's going to play out in really predictable ways. You don't get massive changes in deaths and births. So we have a high degree of certainty about what that's going to look like in the future. The volatile, and so we can plan for that. You know, we can plan for that. We don't need to have the hand wringing. We can plan for that. It's migration that is very volatile, and this is where we seem to have like an absence of sensible, you know, decision making and to Paul's point, approach towards handling migration, because this is very volatile, can have massive impacts on our future population, and there needs to be a very considered I would say, non-partisan approach to what, how we should approach migration in the future. When it comes to deaths and births, we already know that. There's no guessing work there. We don't need a magic crystal ball. We know we have a high degree of certainty about that, how that's going to play out, affect the age structures in the future. And we can respond to that now. That's not an information gap. That's a gap of will.
Yeah, probably a lot of what Tahu's just been saying does feed directly into what you told us earlier. I wonder if you have a comment on Paul's challenge. How are we going to do the how?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I would agree with Tahu here regarding the focus on, what did you say, relentless rangatahi, and also tamariki. But I guess I also would like to highlight, let's not lose the responsibility that the Crown has towards achieving a flourishing population. We know from a health perspective that prevention strategies that work, that create enormous health gain and fiscal gain, are those that have a really strong, responsible, universal approach to the population. And that doesn't mean one size fits all. We know that we've gone backwards some way with respect to, for example, access to housing, with living wage, pay equity. We know that some of the government targets contradict others. So if we want reduced youth mental health need, for example, and yet we have move on orders for people who are experiencing homelessness, including those the age of 14. So we actually really do need to ensure that we have the Crown's responsibilities towards these gains that we're speaking about, as well as fostering the local innovation, or the iwi-led, which needs to then be commissioned in such a way so that hands are off the table. So yeah, I think that the solutions are not necessarily rocket science, and communities are driving these solutions right now, even though they may not be resourced. But we also need to be having these conversations that focus not just on how are we going to ensure our ageing population is well cared for, but how are we going to continue to ensure that we're driving wellbeing equity for the well over 1 million tamariki and rangatahi that we have now and that we are projected to continue to have.
Polly, I think something that you and Tahu both stressed is that there is an awful lot of work happening in communities now, and so it's not that we need simply top-down decisions, but with that ground-up work happening, it needs much greater support at centralised funding levels. Paul, can I bring you back in for a comment at this point?
I mean, can I just add, and I'm really responding to both Polly and Tahu's comments, and particularly the adaptation and pace and the recognition. There is an opportunity for local governments, territorial authorities to consider these questions. In June 2027, they need to submit a long-term plan for the next 10 years, so 27 to 37. I've actually had a look at the existing long-term plans. What puzzles me, amuses me, is that these are enormous documents, typically 300 or 400 pages, which specify down to a very small detail the sort of services and infrastructure that are going to be provided. But they're done in the absence of actually knowing what that community is going to look like in 10 years' time. And some of them, I've got to be honest, some of them provide a very good demographic analysis. So what does the community now look like? What will it look like in 10 years' time? And Tahu's unit has contributed to some of that. But it just strikes me as a really peculiar exercise that, 68, 67 territorial authorities are going to have to submit these plans next year. And it's an opportunity to think about how their communities are going to change. So you get that bottom-up analysis and understanding, and you align your services and infrastructure, and probably things like your rates intake and what that will look like to your population. But it doesn't happen. Not very often, anyway.
Tahu, is he right?
Yeah, but I would say there's an appetite there. We go and speak to local government quite often, and I think they very much understand the challenge. Well, maybe not the granularities of the challenges, but there's an appetite there to want to respond to them. And I think this comes back to having a good, reliable evidence base that they can lean on, and framed in a way that actually means something and is understandable, and probably more importantly is actionable. But I don't think it's for lack of appetite. I think people in local government positions understand that the demography is really important, but there's a sort of a gap there in terms of connecting that evidence base to action.
Thank you. Patrick, you told us that we now spend more on superannuation than education. I'm going to guess that a number of people who are the beneficiaries of that, superannuitants, are happy for the money they get, probably want it to be more in many cases, but will also believe that we should be investing in education to a greater level.
I guess
does there need to be a generational divide in the way that things exist?
No, but I do think we have to be realistic. There's a saying that government is about choosing, and we do have to understand what priorities are being reflected in what governments currently do. And Susan St. John, she's done some work for us at the Commission and as part of our review of retirement income policy last year. And she always said, well, look, it's not helpful to talk about fiscal cost, but what it does reflect is an underlying uneasiness about where the money is going. And so if you look at the large spending on areas like New Zealand super, and then it's perfectly valid to ask questions like, well, if you've got increasing material hardship of the over 65s, is it actually the right policy instrument? We're starting to see increasing spending on, second tier, like accommodation supplement type programs. So maybe this approach of having a universal pension, which by definition can't reflect variations in need, maybe that's just becoming an anachronism. So maybe we do need to have some of these conversations. Now, the problem we have, and this goes back to the theme of the webinar today, is how do you make that process of change? Because where you've got 40% of people over 65, almost solely reliant on New Zealand super, and another 20% who don't get much more, there's anxiety around any change in this space. So this is why you do have to be very careful about how you make change, how you signal change, how you give people time to prepare in advance, and how you can show that you can make change safely. But I don't think we can get away from the fact that we're going to have to start choosing as a country.
I wonder if there is also a society where a lot of people say no to providing more resources for Māori. We say no to immigration, say no to social housing, also say no to greater taxation and no to greater debt. And you can't say no to them all, I think.
Yeah.
Getting to the end of the session, I just wonder if we could go around and get your last thoughts on Paul's challenge. Your last thoughts on any key issues or key ideas or key strategic initiatives that we need to make a change from the place we are sort of stuck in. Perhaps start with you.
I think that was me. Sorry, Simon, you're quite hard to hear.
I'm sorry.
But I'll just start talking anyway. That's fine. Final challenge. Well, really, just picking up on your points around choice. I think that it's really important that we do have these conversations about the role of equity in a society. And I mean, by equity, I mean fairness and justice, not having, two houses. And intergenerational equity being the key, and that the inequities that we have in Aotearoa are a problem for us all. They increase the costs to society, they increase the lack of social cohesion, which has a vicious cycle impact. But we have the virtuous cycle possibility if we can really drive all of our policies, programs, and community development, community empowerment through an equity lens. No matter what colour your cloth, that's going to have positive outcomes. And if we can do that by fostering the well-being and the equity of our tamariki and rangatahi within the context of their whānau and community, then we will all win. And we will have win-wins if we can understand climate change adaptation and all of the other aspects that speak to pro-equity strategies that will then drive outcomes for us all in society. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Patrick, the key thing you're hoping to see that will change things?
Well, I'm naturally an optimistic person, and I'll go back to Fred Dagg. You know, we don't know how lucky we are, and I really just hope that we do use next, few years, the next 10 years or so, to really have some quite difficult conversations as a country. So discussions like this. But, we do have time to start thinking about how we approach the future, how we start reforming, even how we maybe take on some sacred cows, like, the future of New Zealand super. But, we really do need to start having these conversations now, and we have to have them in quite an open way, because otherwise the risk is we wait 10 years and we end up just having to pull at levers and just to do things without thinking through the consequences.
Thank you. Tahu?
I think we've had lots of conversation. We need to start acting. As I've said, there's some things that we know with a great deal of certainty. We know that a sausage can't become a triangle. We know that the triangle is not going to stay a triangle forever. So for me, in terms of those distributional choices, one of those choices is really clear, and that is investment in the triangle. That is not only going to serve Māori and Pacific communities well, it's actually going to serve Aotearoa well. So for me, if we have to make choices, that would be a choice that is going to return benefits regionally and at the national level as well. But we have to start making those choices now.
Thank you. Paul?
Choices now, absolutely. I think we have time, but not too much time. I would dearly love us to develop a population strategy, but as has been clear today, it should not be done in isolation of housing, health, education, employment, superannuation. All of it is actually tied together. So the question I still have, Simon, is the how question. And I would dearly love more to pick up the Finnish word citizen engagement in this discussion.
Citizen engagement, deliberative democracy, all of those things going to become more important. I'm very taken, Tahu, what you just said. We've had a lot of talking, we need some action. But I also want to speak up for keeping the talking going too, the more talking, because it's about changing the debate, about changing the social ideas that we work with. It's about developing social license for the strategy that Paul's been throwing at us. We are pretty much at the end of time now, and I'm going to call on Andrew Jackson again to finish us off.
Thank you, everyone, for that fascinating conversation. I really appreciate the time of the speakers, Simon, for facilitating it, and for all those who have joined us online. And I think the passion in the room says that we do need to move beyond, while maintaining the conversation, to finding the right way forward, to starting to find a way to act. Yes, we do need to make some choices, and the choices are difficult. So I have chosen a karakia to finish off that I thought is important in the situation where we're making difficult choices. Please forgive me if my pronunciation is not perfect. Kia tau te rangamarie ki runga ia tātou katoa. May peace be upon us all, is the prayer for the discussion as we go forward and think about our population and the choices that we have to make. So thank you everyone for joining us, and goodbye. One question I have for Valerie, who's helped facilitate this with the Policy Hub, is what we're going to do with the results from the polls, because the results from the polls are very interesting, and what can people do if they want to continue the conversation and continue to engage. So Valerie, I don't know whether you'd want to say how people can see those polls.
We will be in touch once we figure out where we can put the polls, but if you check in the webinar chat, it gives you the link to where you can see all of our previous seminars, and we will put this recording up as well. You'll be able to find it there. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Kia ora. Are pai atu, atu wa.